Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you. This is KRWG, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Next on Newsmakers, critics say some New Mexico Medicaid cuts are actually costing the state more than any savings. Plus, some New Mexico State University students have ideas for out-of-the-box economic development. And in Focus, we'll talk about the New Mexico legislative session with Rio Grande Foundation President Paul Gessing. Thanks for joining us on Newsmakers. I'm Fred Martino. 2013 New Mexico and Texas Departments of Health data shows 1/4 of Doña Ana County residents needing hospitalization are going to Texas to get those services. But a lower Medicaid reimbursement rate in New Mexico means many Texas doctors are not accepting them anymore. Simon Thompson reports.
This is David Tafoya. His father Joshua says since he was 18 months old, David has suffered from a severe case of epilepsy. Status epilepticus is an intense neurological and medical condition with a high mortality rate. It's characterized by prolonged seizures.
The thing that causes damage is usually the, stop breathing part or lack of oxygen to the brain from the seizure is usually the part you have to watch out for. And in David's case, because they're so prolonged, there's a larger likelihood of a complication to occur.
There is no child neurologist accepting Medicaid in Las Cruces, New Mexico, where the Tafoyas live. So when David has had problems or needed checkups, he's seen a neurologist in El Paso.
There's been instances where he's had a seizure that lasted an hour long, even after we've administered all the treatment. So we'd have to be transferred to El Paso Children's to get treatment and basically get the seizure to even stop.
After 2 years of fits, trauma, and a run of different medications, their neurologist managed to stabilize David's epilepsy, giving hope for a normal life and his parents Carrie and Joshua some peace of mind. But the trauma has left David suffering from PTSD. His mother Carrie says it's been hard to get him to go to the doctor.
He used to have huge screaming fits, hide under the table, refuse to come out, was terrified of being around the neurologist, going to the doctor in general. And over the last year, he's really come around to being, being around his current neurologist. And he knows him, he remembers him, he's comfortable with him.
With a comfortable doctor-patient relationship built over time, David went almost 2 years without a seizure. But the Tafoyas are concerned they may have to start all over again with a new neurologist, as David's current one announced he will no longer see him. The New Mexico Health Department has reduced reimbursement rates to Medicaid providers, citing a $400 million gap between the program's costs and available state revenue. With these lower reimbursement rates, some providers have stopped seeing New Mexico Medicaid patients. Carrie Tafoya says they're going to have to travel all the way to Albuquerque for their son's treatment and even just checkups.
It's already difficult because kids don't like riding in cars for a long time. So now we have to go to Albuquerque, which means 3.5 hours, which is 4 hours round trip, which is going to be hard for them to stay in the car. And that's a lot of screaming.
That means paying for gas, hotel, and parking expenses. The Tafoyas can get the state to reimburse them, but that's concerning to State Senator and Legislative Finance Committee Chair John Arthur Smith. He says whatever funds the state is going to save on Medicaid cuts are likely to be eaten up by travel expenses.
They're penny wise and pound foolish on that. They're not saving money. And then if you really have the client's best interests at heart, quite frankly, I challenge that thought process when they don't take advantage of the closest provider.
Smith says he has flagged the issue with the State Department of Health for review. He says access to care should be simplified and kept nearby for patients like the Tafoyas. Currently, the Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act is fully funded, but starting in 2017, states will begin contributing to the cost. By 2020, states will fund 10% of the expansion, with the federal government paying the other 90%. Smith says the fact that New Mexico can't cover the remaining 10% underscores the need for funding sources more reliable and diverse than oil and gas revenues. The Tafoyas say worse than having to travel all the way to Albuquerque for care is being left in limbo without a neurologist while their son's patient referral is being processed.
I'm assuming we probably won't see anybody for 3 months, which means we're going to go that entire period of time without having anybody to call to ask, like, you know, if he starts acting strangely. He's on some fairly intense medication that does have side effects that include like possibility of depression and you know, in extreme cases like suicidal ideation and stuff like that. So it is serious medication, and he, you know, more than hopefully nothing will happen and it will all be fine. But if something did happen, we basically have no one to call.
Making things even more difficult for the Tafoyas, according to UNM Health Sciences data, there is only one primary care physician for every 1,099 New Mexicans, and the number of medical specialists like neurologists is well below the national benchmark. For KRWG, I'm Simon Thompson.
Medicaid is just one major issue for the New Mexico legislature. Another is economic development. The state has one of the highest unemployment rates in the country. Its median income lags far behind the national average, and while many students attend our state universities, graduates are often forced to leave to find a job. Today we begin a series of reports on KRWG, out-of-the-box economic development. The idea is to attract so-called economic-based jobs, jobs funded by out-of-state money. And to begin our series, we found some ideas from students at New Mexico State University who completed a class taught by State Representative Bill McCamley.
Here's how this is going to work. Each of these young men and women has been working all semester on a project.
So this presentation started from a class that we all registered for. The class is through the Honors College here at NMSU, which was taught by Representative Bill McCamley. So he volunteered his time to come out and teach us about how to create economic base level jobs in the state of New Mexico.
The course itself is called Honors 421 Out of the Box Job Creation.
He assigned us the project of proposing a solution or proposing a policy that would encourage the growth of economic jobs here in New Mexico.
To find out-of-the-box job ways to create economic base-level jobs within the state, to find problems from a unique perspective and to fix them with unconventional and unorthodox means. I was interested in taking this class as it aligned a lot with my future plans and trying to develop jobs in New Mexico that were just out of the ordinary. I believe most businesses think along the lines of doing the exact same thing over and over, so figuring out how to do jobs out of the box really helps New Mexico grow economically, as well as give people who are in other parts of the states chances to get employment that would benefit them greatly.
We had a class of about 8 people, I believe, so we had 8 different presentations, and they were all really great presentations and creative solutions.
My proposal was to a revitalization of the traditional crops in Chimayo, New Mexico. Chimayo, New Mexico is a town just north of Santa Fe that has an amazing culture and an amazing history, and it still does, but it needs to be saved.
Some of them included expanding high-speed railway, encouraging cultural crop growth in the state of New Mexico. We had some education reform. My personal policy proposal was to reform liquor licenses in the state of New Mexico, hopefully to encourage the food service industry, which really benefits a lot from the growing tourism industry here in New Mexico.
My proposal creates jobs as a result of the programs I'm wanting to utilize in order to actually fulfill my proposal, which is the Rocky Mountain Youth Corps, which would be a stepping stone program to the youth of northern New Mexico. I myself have done 3 Rocky Mountain Youth Corps terms over the summers, and it's a great experience, and it teaches you so much, not only about actual work, but actually about college and financial aid and nutrition and life skills, which you just don't normally get in a normal education in the northern part of New Mexico.
My proposal, I think, was really well received. Hopefully Representative McCamley and Mr. Gleason will support a bill that will hopefully implement my proposal here upcoming in the legislative session in January.
Good job.
In focus today, the 2017 legislative session in New Mexico. It is a long one, 2 months, and to get us ready, Paul Gessing is here, a regular guest on the program, the president of the Rio Grande Foundation. Paul, always good to see you.
Good to be here, Fred.
Good to have you here. So let's start off with the 2016 election before we get into the legislative session, because it's going to have a huge impact. Democrats, of course, retaking control of the House, retaining the Senate, but Governor Martino still has her veto pen.
She does, at least in terms of regular legislation, and the constitutional amendments could circumvent that, but that is something that we're going to all see, the strategy and the level of cooperation in Santa Fe together, and whether there's some agreements or whether it's purely partisan bickering and constitutional circumvention. And of course with the constitutional amendments, though, it's not a done deal. The voters then get their say. So this is true.
Right.
No, you're absolutely right, and it's a slower process.
Right.
November of 2018 is when we would have the voters given their say on these issues. That's a long delay for some of these issues that may be top priorities.
Now, since you used the word circumventing when describing this process, I'm curious to find out what is your opinion about it? I mean, this is something that is actually, a lot of people are very divided on this, both Democrats and Republicans, who say that constitutional amendments should be only used in very rare circumstance, not just to make sure that something goes through.
Right. Well, love it or not, the constitutional process in this state does avoid the governor's veto pen, and that is going to be something that's attractive for the Democrats who control both houses. Certainly things like pre-K expansion and tapping the permanent fund, because of that, that's a constitutional priority, obviously. But you're right, a lot of these other legislative ideas could be done with the cooperation of the governor, and she's likely going to veto perhaps things like a minimum wage increase, certainly getting up above certain levels. There's others that tax increases. I don't know if they can raise taxes through a constitutional amendment, but if they want to get around the governor and she's going to veto it, they may try to do that as well. So a wide variety, marijuana legalization.
And that's the one that's been talked about the most. So I want to ask your opinion, whether it's the foundation's opinion or not, on that one, because there's a really interesting argument that's been made for that to be something to go before voters. And that is, of course, that even if New Mexico, like many other states, passes marijuana legalization, the federal law will not be changing as a result of that. And so the argument is having the people vote on that rather than just the legislature sends a message to Washington and sends a message to the congressional delegation. This is the will of the people, whatever that is.
There's a lot of different issues when it comes to that marijuana issue and the Constitution versus the legislative. Certainly, no vote of the people if you do it straight legislatively. Likely the governor vetoes that. But again, the delay in the time period, part of the justification for doing this is the sad state of the budget in Santa Fe, and getting this money coming in estimated about $50 million annually. Delaying that until really the start of 2019 isn't something that I think the Democrats want to see happen. However, strengthening the case is the constitutional amendment with the proviso that the people vote on it, and that shows that support for the issue. So I could see both arguments on that one. The minimum wage, I really don't think that's a constitutional thing, and some of these more run-of-the-mill policies should be kept out of the Constitution, but certainly marijuana is one that I think is a reasonable issue each way.
What impact do you think the shifting politics in Washington will have on New Mexico?
Well, there's a few big ones. The number one is energy. Certainly President Obama was much more enthusiastic about so-called green energy sources, wasn't as thrilled about exploiting energy on federal lands, whether it's coal and a moratorium he had on permitting on coal, the difficulty of permitting on BLM lands, and New Mexico's 40+% federal land. So a lot of the oil and gas companies look at a Trump administration and say, yeah, we're going to be able to go ahead and go get the energy on those federal lands. So that's one shift. The other one is the Clean Power Plan. Now, this isn't as big of a deal here in southern New Mexico, but in northwest New Mexico, San Juan County, they have two coal-fired power plants that were kind of being pushed towards oblivion, if you will. They're already shutting down half of one of them, and Trump is probably going to change direction. Now, they probably won't reopen the half that was being shut down, but certainly that's impactful as well. On the flip side, you have the renewable and the clean and the solar and the wind guys, and they're looking at Donald Trump and saying, holy cow, we're going to lose our subsidies and tax credits and all those exemptions and things that have been provided over the years. So energy is a big one. The other one is healthcare and Medicaid. And we've seen Medicaid expansion and the budgetary implications that that's placed on New Mexico and the rapid increase over the next few years of Medicaid expenditures at the state level as we first 5% and then 10% of the Medicaid expansion under Obamacare becomes a state prerogative. What Trump does about Medicaid, block granting perhaps, repealing Obamacare in its entirety, those are some really interesting discussion items, and I don't know what's going to happen.
Right, and they could have a huge impact on the budget because
huge.
Medicaid is already an enormous part of the budget and would continue to grow if that is not eliminated when apparently the Affordable Care Act is eliminated.
Right, and then of course you have the details of how this is done, because if you block grant, and block grant implies you provide a given set of resources for the state and they have to manage Medicaid. So presumably you have a system where it's more restrained in terms of the states using that money, because quite honestly New Mexico has been taking every dollar they can possibly get from Washington, fleecing the other 49 states, which all the other states try to do the same thing. So it's this mutual game of everybody trying to maximize their federal dollars. Block granting it, I think, would be a very positive thing for both the federal budget, which is relevant, but also long-term patient care, directing resources and giving states the ability to direct those resources to those who are most needy, in need of that kind of medical attention.
Okay, let's move to the budget, because this is the long question, if you will. The Rio Grande Foundation has a number of budget priorities, and the budget is always the big deal. This is what the legislature must do during the session. Even if they get nothing else done,
You're right.
They have to do the budget.
Well, they have to do the budget twice this legislative session, because the special session back in October really didn't adequately address fiscal year 2017, which we are currently in the middle of, literally in the very middle of. It ends in June 30th. We're about $70 million short, and we've already used a vast majority, almost all of what I call couch cushion money. It's you find a quarter or a dollar bill in your couch, and that's what we've been doing. We did in the special session is we looked for all these funds that hadn't been spent and spent them. Now we're going to have to start making some real tough decisions about what the role of government is. And we've recommended in our report that's available at riograndefoundation.org certain things. We've say we should tackle the branch campus issue and the proliferation of branch campuses. We've talked about film subsidies. Now, all of this is made very difficult by the fact that we're in the middle of this session right now, or this budget year right now. So the ability to make quick changes on a dime is very limited. But of course, we have this budget problem not eliminated in FY17. We're passing a budget for fiscal year 2018, which begins July 1. $300 million is what they're looking at then. So we have at least the time to make some bigger decisions about where we're going. Of course, then you get into the politics. Democrats might not be enthusiastic about cutting some of the spending. Governor doesn't want to raise taxes. So you have, in many ways, irresistible force and an immovable object. Will we, say, have a budget shutdown? I don't know. It's it's going to be a very interesting session.
Okay. The other thing that really ties into the budget that is a priority for your organization and for many people and many legislators is tax reform.
Right.
And I know one of the things that is kind of an overarching principle for your organization is the notion that we shouldn't play favorites. And our big revenue coming from that gross receipts tax has favorites all over it, right?
That's
because
very
it's
true.
got exemptions,
Very true.
Scores of exemptions.
Yeah, and so far this has been a bipartisan discussion. Now, things could go sideways very easily, and when tax reform becomes just tax increases, that's when we jump off of that particular train, so to speak. But right now, Jason Harper, an Albuquerque area representative, a Republican, and Bill McCamley, a representative from right here in Las Cruces, they're leading the discussion, so to speak. And so far, the principles that have been laid out are very reasonable. Trying to reduce or eliminate pyramiding, that's taxing and then taxing an activity again, and that makes New Mexico less competitive in manufacturing and some of these economic activities that we want to get into. There's the exemptions and deductions and bringing people and businesses into the tax structure that are not currently there. That's very important. Bringing the rates down and how low you can go within reason, those are the kinds of things that are going to be very interesting. Of course, the food tax issue is kind of this, I would call it a red herring. We don't have a problem organizationally. I don't think anyone should have a problem with across the board taxes at a low level, and lowering those rates is good for everybody. Throw in the fact that a lot of folks are on food stamps at the low income levels, and I really don't think the concern should be over taxing food, yes or no, but how we do an intelligent pro-economic growth tax reform that will create jobs, create economic growth, and squeeze out a lot of these special interest exemptions.
Of course, as you know, reinstituting the food tax, even if you lower the overall rate for the GRT, is a non-starter with many folks. And one of the things that we often don't talk about when we talk about tax reform that I think is important to address is that, you know, if we were to dramatically change the tax to where revenue would drop from the tax, this puts many people in a bind, as is the case in many states which do not have income taxes. Their property taxes rise dramatically. And so folks, particularly on a limited income, many retirees, for example, find they can no longer live in their home. They have to move.
Well, the goal is, and that's of course a very difficult thing in tax policy, because coming up with a tax rate that makes sense in the models versus the reality is a real challenge, and I'm not going to underestimate that.
Right, yeah.
But the idea is to do something that's revenue neutral-ish and long-term, not just long-term, but in the immediate short-term, will generate the kind of business and economic growth that we've so lacked in this state for a long time, in part due to the gross receipts tax, because we have this tax at rates in excess of 7 or even 8%. And the group that it hits the hardest happens to be small businesses and entrepreneurs. It's a long story short, but if you're a big enterprise, you can avoid paying a lot of the gross receipts taxes because you produce an item or you pay on a service. Whereas a small business, you pay an accountant, you pay an attorney, you pay all these various service providers, and they have rates that they're paying on the tax of 7 and 8%. So if we can make this happen in a revenue neutral-ish manner, that will be a fantastic thing for the state moving forward.
Okay, well, they're related to revenue. We've already talked about two of the things that are new that are likely to come up. I shouldn't say new, but new maybe in the sense of getting something passed, marijuana legalization and the minimum wage. There is another one, though, that, again, you have Democrats and Republicans both who are very concerned about how to do this, expanded pre-K. Right. And your organization's concerned about this. In fact, we posted one of your columns on expanded pre-K, which raised questions not only about how to fund it, which is a big question in New Mexico, but also whether to do it at all, that there's some research that raises real questions about this.
So the dominant discussion on pre-K has been, should we or should we not tap the permanent funds, the permanent fund being oil and gas money that's been set aside for various purposes to fund universities, to fund K-12, et cetera. Our concern is indeed, are we getting something that's going to be helpful for New Mexicans moving forward, especially young people, the kids going to school, and we, of course, want to reform K-12 and make that entire system more effective because we've already got this system in place, and I would like to see some more reforms to bring us at least top-notch within the United States, if not a world-class K-12 system. But
what do you say, though, to those who argue, many educators who argue, that fixing K-12 requires pre-K? In other words, students who are better able to enter K-12?
Well, Head Start, for example, is one of those federally funded pre-K programs. Happens that we just saw a new study come out saying that New Mexico has the worst ranked, 50th, in terms of Head Start, our program, because the money comes from Washington, but we ultimately have a lot to say about administering it at the state level. And Head Start has already been a program that repeatedly the Government Accountability Office, their own kind of think tank internally at the federal level, has said the gains from pre-K, from Head Start wear off by the time these kids get into kindergarten, first grade, and move through the system. So I just don't see that as being a real argument. I see the system itself that we're already funding, spending billions of dollars a year, needs to be improved. And anyone in that system or their kid or as a teacher, I think, can understand that there are reforms that can be made to improve it.
All right.
And we're going to work on that.
We'll have to see what happens.
Exactly.
It's very interesting and a controversial issue. Paul, we'll see you at the end of the session for an update. Thank you for being here.
Do that. All right. Thanks, Fred.
That's our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's morning edition, 5 to 9. Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now, noon to 2, and All Things Considered, 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.